All right. So here we are, Thursday. Oh my goodness, and no class. No class next week. That's kind of sad. Now, if for some reason you're feeling sad, lonely next Tuesday, and you want to have a Zoom meeting, just send me an email and I will absolutely meet with you on Zoom. Um, I'm so sorry. And if you have questions, that kind of thing. Also, next week is a really good time for you to work on your book review, which is due on the 30th, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving. Also, I did suggest, it really is just a suggestion of due dates on the weekly questions. So maybe you can turn them in one at a time rather than all three at the very end. And that suggested, really just suggested due date for the Reagan question is next Friday, although you could pretend it's tomorrow and work on it today, but I know, yeah, I know you're busy. I'm busy too, so I get it. Also, bunch of people emailing, can I turn stuff in late? Ah, gosh. If it's like a month late, that's kind of late. If it's last week late, please, yeah, go ahead. Okay? Now there's a limit, which I'll be as flexible as I can with on how many things you can turn in late. But if you're going to turn stuff in late, make sure you do a good job on it. That way I'll think, well, at least they took extra time and did a good job. And it's tricky on my end because I know pandemic, I know, man, I'm in it too. And things are rough, but also most of you are keeping up and turning your stuff in on time. And college class, got to be as fair to everybody as I can. So I get it. I know it's hard. I'll be as flexible as I can to you. But stuff that's over a month late and you just now noticed, it's kind of, work on the more current stuff and do the book review. That's probably the best that I can do for you at this point. And also, just a reminder, because I've had a couple of you, well, I have this learning issue, or I need extra time because of this reason, or I have trouble seeing, or that sort of thing. You got to go through the student accessibility services. Otherwise, if I give you extra time, I have to give everyone that much extra time. So, but if SAS says I give you extra time, I do what they say. That's just one of those things. So, not trying to, be hard-nosed about this, but also, wanting to make sure everything's above board and fair and all that stuff. So, and hopefully, again, I'll catch up on the grading by this weekend, and if not, by Monday or Tuesday, because, we don't have class, so I'll get caught up as well. Okay. So your weekly question's about Reagan, so we should probably see if we can talk about Reagan. Excuse me. And we're to the point where I vividly remember everything that happened, that we're talking about, almost. Of course, I was a kid for some of this stuff. And I forget sometimes I really was alive during 68, but I was so little, I don't remember much about it. I think my first public news sort of memory is the lunar landing, which I know some of you think was made up, and they did on a sound stage at Fox, what is it, movies or something like that. But I think it was real. I don't know. But I remember watching it on TV. Maybe it was real. I don't know. I think we were going to talk about Watergate today. And before we get started, any questions, comments, concerns? I forgot to check the chat. All right. We're going to talk about, oh, somebody's coming in. And I will check the roll either in the middle or at the end because I forgot. So, and I started late. So not really late, just a minute. All right, so let's talk about Watergate. I know Watergate was in Forrest Gump, so you know everything about it. So I don't even know why I'm going over it, but we should, right? So election, 1972, Nixon versus George McGovern. My grandmother campaigned for George McGovern. My grandmother was a hippie. she was about one generation too late. She was an old hippie, but she was a hippie and really liked George McGovern, really hated Nixon. And I remember my mother and my grandmother fought about this all the time. And I was probably 6 at the time period, and I still remember this. So McGovern from Dakota, I think it was, we talked about this before. You're going to pick a guy to run for president. You probably shouldn't pick a guy from a state where nobody lives. However, I know Joe Biden, Delaware, but he'd been vice president. So McGovern had been a senator. Anyway, so for whatever reason, Nixon's campaign staff and volunteers were nervous because Nixon was just kind of an edgy guy. He was a little nervous, maybe a little paranoid, kind of depends on which biographer you like. But they were concerned that there would be some strategy that would cause Nixon to be defeated. So a group within the campaign staff and volunteers called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, good name, decided they would break into the Watergate Hotel and Office complex where the Democratic National Committee had rented office space so that they could steal the campaign plans and strategy. So they tried to do this. They got caught, the group of guys that got caught. So the police arrested them, and they didn't take ID with them because, if you got caught, you didn't want to be identified with the campaign or with Nixon. Somebody had a little notebook with some phone numbers. They called one of the phone numbers, and it rang to the White House switchboard. And so they started an investigation. Now, this is the campaign year, so they don't finish the investigation. There is some news about this, but it's not major news. I mean, it's news, but it's not the big news, because there was breaking news about negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. Plus, there's all kinds of other rowdy stuff still going on during this time period, so it didn't get covered. I mean, it got covered, but it wasn't fully investigated. So, and Congress, of course, is at the end of their session. They're running for office as well. So the investigation body is busy too, because Congress also needs to investigate stuff like this. So when they come back after the election is really when it gets investigated. Nixon, there's no evidence that Nixon helped plan this, suggest this, had any idea this was going to happen. There's all sorts of evidence that he knew it happened right after it happened, because, they got arrested and people reported it to Nixon. And his strategy, rather than saying, oh my gosh, look what the idiots who volunteered for me did, it wasn't my idea, but he thought that would hurt him during the campaign, and he's correct, that would have hurt him during the campaign. So rather than announcing it to the press or admitting it or investigating it himself, they just covered it up. So, excuse me. As the investigations began after the election, which was a landslide for Nixon, it was not even close. After the investigations began, Nixon had a group of people within his administration referred to as the plumbers, and they were supposed to plug the leaks in the investigation. So anybody who talked was going to get in some sort of trouble. It's the United States, so we can't throw you in jail, although maybe we could, I don't know. But they got IRS investigations, people got fired. There were lots of things that happened that were not legitimate. And the more of these that happened, and the more people who got interviewed by Congress as they were investigating, by the House in particular, the more sketchy this thing starts to look. So what they find out in the interviews in the House investigation is that Nixon has a tape, a recording, of audio recording of every conversation that happens in his office, the Oval Office. So the House, the committee who's investigating this, asked for those tapes and those transcripts, because he also has transcripts made. And I promise you, this was before we had all this social media. So, one of the beautiful things about being my age is You know how we always give you guys a hard time that are younger. It's like, yeah, back in my day, we weren't as dumb. We were every bit as dumb. We just didn't have social media, so there's not as much evidence of it. Nixon taped all his conversations, and it was really so he could go back and listen to them and um, remind himself of what he promised, what other people promised. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that was a good thing or a bad thing. It was just a thing. I don't know that most presidents did this. However, um, when they asked Nixon to turn over the tapes, Nixon says, no, I won't. National security risk, because there's some fairly confidential things that go on here, which I'm sure that is partly true, but that, of course, is not why he's not wanting to turn over the tapes. So that goes to the Supreme Court because he refuses. The House appeals to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, Nixon, turn over the tapes, in a more Supreme Court sort of way. And then Nixon turned over the tapes and the transcripts, which might have had some key parts erased. And then Congress has just had it with Nixon. They go full impeachment. So the House issues the articles of impeachment and the Senate plans the trial. The Republican leadership in the Senate goes to Nixon and says, hey, Nixon, just want you to know, with all the evidence we've seen, and there are also several other people who went to jail over this. So for erasing evidence, they interviewed Nixon's personal secretary, and she says she accidentally erased this. You know, nobody believed, but and she doesn't go to jail. But there are other people within Nixon's staff that do go to jail. I think H.R. Haldeman goes to jail. G. Gordon Liddy is probably the most famous one. And then there's a fellow named Charles Colson who goes to jail. And then he writes a book about how that was the best thing that ever happened to him because it made him re-examine his life, and he became a really devout guy and started a prison ministry. So, I mean, at least one good thing comes out of this, right? But Nixon is told by the Senate Republicans that with the evidence that they see and with other people on their way to jail, and they said, we don't see anything we can do besides kick you out of office. And maybe you should resign before we have the trial. And Nixon says, I will never resign. And then he resigns a couple days later because honestly, who wants to be the first president kicked out of office? Now, in your lifetimes, you have seen a couple of impeachments, haven't you? You saw, I don't know if you're paying attention, and some of you weren't born yet, with Clinton, but there was the Clinton impeachment, and then there was a Trump impeachment, which you may or may not have noticed because there's so many other things going on. Yep, Trump for sure. And, you know, on this one, there's all sorts of evidence documented. Nixon knew, you know, things were going down. I would never want to compare stuff in the modern era to, and I realize this isn't very distant, but you know, the press worked differently back then. During this time period, I think one of the most important things about the Nixon presidency is how it changes the press. And before this, the press knew stuff about presidents, they just didn't tell it. So, you know, when Kennedy was president and he was having all those parties where they paid for prostitutes to come and, you know, there's all kinds of rowdy stuff going on there. The press knew about this because they were invited to those parties, but they didn't cover it. Of course, the press knew that FDR was paralyzed from the waist down and couldn't walk, but they made sure to not picture FDR in photos or in videos where you could see that. They also knew that he wasn't just getting treatments when he went to Warm Springs, Georgia. I mean, the press knew stuff, but they didn't cover it for whatever reason. They felt like it was part of their obligation to preserve the dignity of the presidency. All of that is out after Nixon, because once with Nixon, if they start covering stuff, and part of the reason they started covering stuff with Nixon is they didn't like Nixon because he was kind of an irritating guy, apparently. So once the door is open with Nixon, now we know all kinds of stuff about our president. So it's either great or terrible. I don't know which. And I would say that the media wasn't partisan during this era, but I think it wasn't as overtly partisan. And we didn't have news networks where it was their business to cover the news, so they made money. I'm not saying that the reporters back then didn't get paid. Clearly they did, but it was a different sort of money-making venture. You know, it was seen as not maybe the lead money maker. It wasn't part of the entertainment package, I guess, that you get with your television. Of course, there was no cable back then. So I think this is the beginning of the change of how media covers the presidency, which leads to all sorts of changes, which might make things better and might make things more confusing. Probably both. Okay. So Nixon's got to go. He resigns, and I remember watching this on television, and he goes off on the helicopter to Yorba Linda in California, which is where he lived. Well, they took him from the helicopter to the airport, and then the Air Force One dropped him off, but in California. But when he was leaving, he does this V for victory sign. I remember he crossed his arms and stuff, and I thought, man, this guy's confused. And I wasn't very old, and I understood it wasn't a victory. But, you know, I'm sure he's stunned and that sort of thing. Well, anyway, he goes off and does his thing and does not go to jail, which we're about to talk about here for a sec. But Nixon resigned. So who's going to be president? It's going to be Gerald Ford. And unique thing about Gerald Ford, the only person in our history who was never elected vice president or president who became president. And I would not expect that to happen anytime soon, although I know there's lots of speculation that somebody who's going to be vice president might be president sometime in the next 4 years. But be nice and, you know, okay. This is an unusual situation, and Ford's in a weird spot. He's in a really weird spot. So Ford thinks that the best thing to do with this whole Watergate, should we prosecute the president thing, is just get it over with. So he decides to pardon Nixon as his first official action. So I will suggest to you that was unpopular overall. Now, Nixon certainly had his supporters. He truly did. And he had a lot of them. You know, this is not a time period where everybody agrees on everything. I don't know that we've had very many of those time periods. So a lot of people, even Nixon supporters, recognize he probably overstepped. Probably. There are people like my mother, who was like the biggest Nixon fan in the world, who said he just did what everyone else did. It's only every other president's done, only he got caught. And it's like, I don't know if every other president has destroyed evidence that the Supreme Court asked to be turned over. However, you know, I don't know. My mother, maybe she had some inside information about this. But at any rate, Ford pardons Nixon. And there were a lot of people who thought that Nixon should at the very least have a criminal trial. But this eliminates that opportunity. Nixon is pardoned. And a lot of people just go like, well, I don't even like Ford anymore. And some people will say that Ford and Nixon had a deal, that Nixon only appointed Ford as vice president because he agreed that if Nixon got prosecuted, that he would pardon him. And there's no evidence to suggest that at all. Nixon and Ford were not friends. They really weren't. They really didn't represent the same part of the party, if that makes any sense. I suspect it does if you pay much attention to politics, because you've noticed, like you probably noticed, Joe Biden is president-elect. And I know there's still challenges and the election hasn't been certified. And I know. But you may have noticed that there are people within the Democrat Party who are suggesting who Joe Biden should select in his cabinet. And you may have noticed that Kamala Harris is on a different side of the Democrats. And you may have noticed when you're paying attention to Trump and Pence that those guys don't represent the same parts of the Republican Party either. And that's, of course, very common. You know, we've talked about that before. So there were people, Nixon represented a more conservative part of the party. Ford represented the more moderate part of the party. And there were people that just liked Nixon more and people that thought Ford was more presentable, which she probably was. But once Ford pardons Nixon, it's going to make it really hard for him to win a term of his own. He also has some other things to deal with. The economy is bad. Okay, the economy is terrible, terrible during this time period. Really high inflation, which we have not really dealt with in our lifetimes. Well, I have because I'm old, but it was when I was a kid. A really high unemployment, which we have dealt with in our lifetimes, but not for the same reasons. Um, Oil crisis and shortage, oh my goodness, during this era, and it'll continue during the Carter administration, there were gas shortages. And I think the only time that we've seen things like that recently, wasn't it a couple of years ago, there was a hurricane or something, everybody went nuts and bought all the gas and you couldn't get gas and it was weird. It's sort of like toilet paper is now, but 2 years ago. It was about 2 years ago, I think. But anyway, this was for years and there were certain days that you could go, only certain days you could buy gas and it was by the last number on your license plate. And if you didn't get there early, sometimes they ran out. And in big cities, you had to line up. And sometimes people try to hold places in line for other people, and people got shot over that foolishness. But it was a real legitimate shortage, and the gas was expensive once you got it too. So dang. Okay. So oil crisis and shortage, inflation on day-to-day items, mostly food. Yeah, so food and gas are really high. So this disproportionately, well, it affects everybody, but because of how budgets work, it disproportionately affects poorer people. It's a huge mess, huge mess. So Ford decided he would start a program called Whip Inflation Now, which really wasn't an effective program. We'll just go with that. So the economy does not improve. And the American public did not really trust Ford because the first thing that he did was pardon Nixon. And I know, again, not overall, but whether you trusted him or not, if you're super broke and you can't get gas for your car, you're going to be irritated. So Ford is not going to get elected. He's also challenged by another Republican, which doesn't typically happen to a sitting president. And this other Republican was Ronald Reagan, who was a very articulate fellow. So even though people thought Ford was, I think the word we used in the notes was affable, super nice guy, and generally seen as very honest, that sort of thing, his presidency is fairly ineffective because of the economy. And he's also playing cleanup after Nixon. And the way he cleaned up didn't necessarily please everyone. Now, I promise you, 10 or 15 years later, people look back at this and went, you know what? Ford probably did the right thing because if we had that controversy going on and on and on for a couple of years, it would have really compounded the economic chaos. And, you know, looking back, people think he probably did the right thing, that nothing good would have been served by putting Nixon into jail. Surely not Ford. Oh, side note, cultural side note, Gerald Ford, president, is married to Betty Ford, his wife, and she had some issues with chemical dependency. She was an alcoholic, and she ends up developing the Betty Ford Center, which is where celebrity type people went to go get off of whatever they were addicted to. And that became very, I don't know if popular is the right word, but I will say, we haven't really talked about the culture of the 70s, but everything you think is the culture of the 60s is probably really the culture of the 70s, where there's lots of drug use and people are pretty wild and they party a lot. There's some of that kind of toward the end of the 60s, but you really see that a lot in the 70s. Not me, stop thinking that. Remember, I'm like in elementary school during this time period. And my parents, they're, you know, very conservative. So yeah, we go to church 3 times a week. We don't do that kind of stuff. So, but the country's a little nutty. You know, there's birth control pill was kind of a new thing, so people are trying it out a lot. And there's a lot of STDs, there's a lot of drug use, there's a lot of alcohol use, and also we're just not happy about how our country's going. So it's a rough time. Yeah, I know some of you think, well, it's kind of like now. I don't know that it's kind of like now. Maybe in some ways it probably is, but by the end of the 70s into the 80s, our response culturally is we got to clean up. And if you look at cultural history, which we don't look at very much in survey class, you'll notice that's kind of what we do in the United States. We'll go like, woohoo, you know, and have a party decade or two, and then we'll go back and have a more conservative decade or two, and it kind of swings back and forth. I really could not even hazard a guess as to whether we're conservative or liberal right now. I don't even know. But I think it's easier to look back at certain eras. And this era, Nixon kind of brings in conservatism in a way, and then it'll kind of get compounded politically while the cultural conservatism follows a little bit more slowly. My impression, which you don't have to agree with. Okay, so Ford, he's going to run in 76. I remember it quite well because it was bicentennial year. We had all sorts of parties. We were super patriotic where I lived. So, and we loved fireworks in rural Missouri. So, yeah, we had all kinds of parties for the bicentennial year, all sorts of celebrations, flags everywhere. And where I grew up was a very, very conservative Republican area. So I distinctly remember my relatives thinking the entire world was going to fall apart because Jimmy Carter got elected. Now, looking back, that may be one of the silliest things that I can remember politically from my childhood. I know some of you are going, why do you even have political memories from your childhood? Because I'm odd that way. But Carter promises he will never lie to the American people. And I remember he gets interviewed, I think it may have been by Playboy magazine, which people read for the articles, as I recall. And he told them that, because he said he would do an interview and he would answer any question. Because, I mean, Carter's like a super Southern Baptist Sunday school teaching kind of guy. And he also has a wife who's fairly assertive. So, you know, he's a good dude. He is legitimately a good dude. So they asked him, like, have you ever cheated on your wife? And he said, no, I haven't. But once I lusted in my heart, which is such a Baptist answer. Good job, Jimmy Carter. And I'm sure he repented of that. However, Carter is a good dude, promises never to lie to the American people. If you look in the, what is it, the campaign commercial site, what was that? Crud, why can't I remember the name of that site? Living Room Candidate, I think is what it's called. A lot of his commercials are him in blue jeans and he's sitting on his tractor. Hi, I'm Jimmy. And he's got a nice Southern accent and he just sounds just so pleasant. Now, behind the scenes, Jimmy Carter is not a humble peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. His family owns a multi-million-dollar peanut farm, and he is a graduate of the Naval Academy and has a degree in nuclear physics. So he's not just your average guy, but he really does kind of come off as your average guy. And he's really unassuming and nice and, you know, helpful and all that kind of stuff. So we go, you know what? We just need a guy like this because we've just had a whole bunch of guys that lie to us. And we're not just talking Nixon. We'd had LBJ before. And then we're starting to find out that maybe Kennedy wasn't as wholesome as pure as it seemed he had been. So, like, we just want a guy we can trust. We want Jimmy Carter from Plains, Georgia, who promises to never lie to the American people. And, you know, he probably didn't, I don't know. I mean, I didn't keep track of everything he said. But Jimmy Carter, super nice dude. Nicest ex-president probably ever. Although some of you are going, well, what about Bush and Obama and Clinton? Like, you know, those guys have interesting ex-presidencies as well, especially that Bush-Clinton thing. I don't get that, but it's pretty fascinating. They work together on all kinds of stuff. And Those two families became really good friends, and they're nothing alike at all. But, you know, that's the way it goes. But back to Carter. Sorry. Okay. Carter, foreign policy, he says he is going to have a humanitarian-based foreign policy. You remember Wilson's moral diplomacy, it works about as well. Now, the one really good thing that almost everybody agrees is really good from the Carter presidency is the Camp David Accords, which is a legitimate peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, where they agree that they will stop fighting. They had been in and out of small wars for the last 10 or 15 years, really disrupted peace within the Middle East, and of course, our access to oil, which is distressing to us. I know. But this is historic. It's really a big deal. And it really kind of establishes a more secular government trend in Egypt. It's going to end up costing, it was Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And Sadat will be assassinated. Excuse me, that's a big mistake. I know they're both deceased, you know, either way, but one's intentional and now one is state sanctioned and one is not. But he gets assassinated by people within his own country, Egypt, that don't want peace. Because for some of the elements within those two countries, they want a consistent war. It fits their political view, their eschatological view, the end of the world kind of view, or they make money from it. And it could be all three. But anyway, the Camp David Accords end up, Egypt and Israel's leaders got Nobel Peace Prizes for this. And that really was built on Nixon's shuttle diplomacy. And one of the things I think would be good for us as a society to realize and be helpful if we had press that covered this kind of stuff. And I think historians do, but you know, even you don't always read your history book, and it's an assignment. So a lot of people don't read about history, is what one presidential administration does that's built on another presidential administration's work. And I think often those things that build from one presidency to another are the most important things we do. And this diplomacy and this change in foreign policy that you see with Nixon, which is in part carried on by Carter, not completely, it's crucial stuff. It's really a big deal. Just as an aside, have you noticed that once I start talking about history, I don't cough? See how good history is for me. So Camp David Accords are a really big deal. And if you're wondering, since I had my little presidents build on each other stuff, one of the things that I remembered hearing about on some news program that no one probably listens to is how quickly we are developing the corona vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, and how that work probably goes all the way back to the George W. Bush, younger Bush administration, where he looked at what the National Institutes of Health did and about how vulnerable we were to pandemics, and changed a whole lot of processes, procedures, and how research is done at the national level. And that those changes, which were carried through in the Obama administration and then into the Trump administration, are probably why they were able to have so much rapid success with developing these vaccines, which is interesting because politicizing them has probably made people think, well, I'm not trying that because I don't know which party had, politics, yeah. But at any rate, there are lots of important things that are carried through from one presidency to another. And, you know, with Nixon, it's the change in foreign policy away from we've got to constantly threaten each other to we've got to be negotiating and working with each other on things we can work with, which you'll see Carter do a little, not as much. And then you'll see Reagan do a lot, but while he's also threatening, it's very confusing, but while he's threatening the Soviet Union as well. All right, back to Carter. Panama Canal Treaty, that might be a good thing. Kind of depends on your opinion of that. will suggest to you that during that era, remember too, I'm a kid and grew up in the middle of the country where it's super um, conservative. That was not so popular at the time. This was the idea that we would return ownership of the Panama Canal to Panama because, you know, we had overthrown the country so we could build a canal there. And some people saw that as bad. So the thought was, you know, we'd right a historical wrong here. We'll turn control of the canal over to the country where it actually exists. And the couple of problems with that people saw. One, you know, we're still in the Cold War and we're still worried about the evil, godless communists. And there's more of them in Central and South America than ever before. So we're concerned that Fidel Castro or somebody will get control of the canal. And there was more, I don't want to say legitimate, but a larger concern than you might imagine. Again, probably not legitimate and certainly never happened. And the other concern was that the leadership in Panama is probably not always the best. And that's going to be a legitimate concern. But, you know, we're still feeling very comfortable sending our military to Panama when we feel like we need to. And we'll do it a couple times. So Panama Canal Treaty returned the canal to Panama either on the last day of 1999 or the first day of 2000. I can never remember. But it's theirs. By then, the evil, godless communists are pretty much not an issue. So it hasn't been an enormous problem, although we do occasionally send troops to Panama to, you know, help them stabilize things. I'm sure they want the help. The human rights-based foreign policy is pretty inconsistent because, you know, there's anytime we say we have a human rights-based foreign policy, and there's China in the modern era who in the earlier days buys a lot of stuff from us, and then in the later days we buy a lot of stuff from them and they buy a lot of our debt. We're not very consistent with how we see human rights in China. And I don't know, maybe this is the part of the news you pay attention to. I'm not trying to be rude, I'm sorry, that sounded wrong, but a lot of people are more in tune with popular culture than I am, like every one of you probably. And sports and China, that has been really kind of an interesting thing to look at over the last couple of years, where especially like with the NBA, but it's also true with the NFL, and it's very true with soccer, that there are certain team owners or athletes who may say something negative about China, and then very quickly other athletes or team owners will condemn that because the market share in China is increasing so much. So moral diplomacy, human rights in China, it's a little tricky for the United States. So that's going to be an issue, a little bit of an issue here, but the bigger part of the inconsistency is probably with Iran. And you're thinking like, why do we even care about Iran? I don't know, we end up in a little conflict with them. We had set up a dictatorship in Iran in the 50s because we, you know, oil, and we didn't like who their leaders were, that sort of thing. So we just overthrew their leaders and set up our own dictator who was legitimately a dictator and suppressed free speech and that sort of stuff. I think his name was Rajiv Pahlavi, but we called him the Shah of Iran. They are about to overthrow him and kill him. So he appeals to the United States and says, hey, can I come stay there? And he's old and says he has cancer. I think he did, and was going to die. So he asked if he'd come to the United States for medical treatment. So we said yes for humanitarian reasons. And so he came over. And then Iran says, hey, send our dictator back because we'd like to execute him. And we go like, no, that would violate human rights. And they're thinking, well, you installed a dictator who consistently violated human rights, and now you're concerned about his human rights? Darn. So they take over the US Embassy, and there are about 100 hostages there. And our thought was, well, little puny Iran, we're going to send some military dudes, and the military dudes will get the hostages back. And apparently the plan is not ideal. They send, they're going to start in, I think it's from Saudi Arabia, but the helicopters take off, and I guess a sandstorm happens. Helicopters end up crashing into each other, and most of the people assigned to the rescue mission die before they really get very far off the ground. And of course, this makes us look pretty inept. We can't get hostages back from Iran. We're also in SALT II talks with the Soviet Union, but our national security advisor is a very anti-Soviet guy, so probably sabotages these things. His name is Zygmunt Brzezinski. And I think his daughter is a cable news person. I can't think of her first name, but she's really blonde, and I've seen her, Mia, or I don't know who she is. I really don't know. But she's got a cable news show with some guy that I think she might be married to. But anyway, and her last name's Brzezinski. But he's Polish and very anti-Soviet, as you would be in that era if you were Polish. I mean, it kind of fits. So maybe he sabotages the talks a little bit, but those blow up. And then the dang evil, godless communists from the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan, which historically is a bad call. It's really hard to be successful when you invade Afghanistan because apparently of the topography plus how the local governments work, which they're, very regional rather than national. They fight within each other, so it's kind of a mess. But so we end up arming the Afghans, which might come back to bite us a little later. But our protest of the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan is we're going to boycott the Olympics that are occurring in Moscow. And that just ticks people off. So here's Carter with Camp David Accords, yay, but everything else kind of crap for Carter. The economy gets worse, much worse. We developed something called a misery index, which measures inflation, interest rates, and unemployment. And it gets to historic levels during that era. It gets really bad. Lots of people become unemployed. Interest rates are so high that it's really hard to buy a house. And day-to-day prices are really high. And it really is a bad time economically. And then Carter decides in his campaign, he'll give a speech where he says, if you guys were more involved and, were less selfish, then probably things would be better. So tip to you, if you're ever running for president and stuff's going wrong, probably don't blame the people you want to vote for you. So Carter's not going to win re-election. I mean, he's honest, but that was his success. He was honest. Everything else is kind of bad except Camp David Accords. Also, we have the rise of the moral majority. For a very long time, people who were more conservative, religious kind of people stayed out of politics. Not our whole history. You've looked at our history. There are times where they're super involved and you see them in social movements, but you don't always see them like directly involved in politics. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. This will be a resurgence of that. So this is a coalition between conservative Catholics, Mormons, Jews, Christians, pro-life, very nationalistic. And this is where you might see, if you study this kind of stuff, really some more convergence. We've kind of gone away from that convergence of church and state, which we saw at the beginning of the Cold War because of Vietnam and Watergate and that kind of stuff, where we just didn't trust the governments. The churches didn't trust them either. But we're kind of going back to that, where, go USA is also go Jesus. So those things go together again. So these churches tend to be very nationalistic. I'm not saying that they're still that way. Some of you go like, no, I go to one of those churches, and we're not. I'm just saying, as a movement and in this era, there's a really big coalition of these folks who get very active in politics and campaign and maybe give sermons about who you should vote for, which is technically illegal if you're a nonprofit or church sort of thing. But you start to see that more during this era. And those folks really, really liked Ronald Reagan. Really, really liked Ronald Reagan. So those guys will back him. Okay. Stuff you got to know. I am going to ask you about Roe versus Wade, okay? I'm going to ask you about it. So make sure you know this, Roe versus Wade, okay? Because that's one of those court decisions that everybody's just supposed to know about. You know what I'm saying? So there's like 10 of them probably in US history. This is, it is. It's very controversial. It's really big deal. And still it's something people like to argue about in classes, on Facebook, I don't know, in your personal life, at Thanksgiving, remotely, on Zoom, I don't know, or not remotely, however you guys are going to do it. But Roe versus Wade, and interesting too, I know we've talked about this a little bit, but the case, the woman, Norma McCorvey, who is Roe, is from Texas, and her lawyer's from Austin, Sarah Weddington. And there are certain states where you can get an abortion and certain states where you can't. So it's, you know, it's one of those federalism kind of things, states' rights sort of things. And Texas was one of those states where you could not. So people who lived in Texas, if they wanted to do this, could either fly to another state or you could drive. I'm not saying they banned you from driving. Travel to another state, or often people went to Mexico to have an abortion because it was illegal. Or there were other things that happened which we won't talk about, but people would attempt those at home. She doesn't end up getting the abortion. However, the case does end up at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court decides that access to an abortion in the first 3 months should be a right and something that states cannot infringe upon. Now, just the first 3 months, because there's a discussion at what term is the fetus a person and has rights, and it's not necessarily the full discussion that happens in that case. And this is also 73, so their technology is not that great. And to be fair, kids born in this era who are born prematurely, they don't have as high a survival rate as they do now. You know, my youngest brother was born in 75, and he was really sick and weighed about 4 pounds. Now, about 4 pounds nowadays, people go like, yeah, I'll be in the hospital for a week and he'll be all right, typically. And my brother's case was more complex than that, I'm certain of it. However, they gave very little hope that he would survive, in part because he was so small and they didn't have great technology. And he was not that early. You know, he was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 weeks early. Yeah. But, you know, to have a baby at 4 months in this time, the baby, yeah, there's very little chance he would survive. But at any rate, different states got to make different decisions. And this, as you might imagine, becomes a very controversial case. And federal government will limit this with the Hyde Amendment. And I don't know that I'll ask you directly about the Hyde Amendment, but there it is. Prohibits the use of federal funds for abortion, except in the case of incest or rape. And then states will add extra requirements, age requirements. If you're below that age, you have to have parental consent. There's lots of different things that states will add to it, fetal sonogram, that kind of stuff. And sometimes the Supreme Court says those things are okay. Sometimes they say they're not. Another really important case, and we talked about this kind of in passing when we talked about, when we talked about affirmative action. This is the case that probably offends it as well, affirmative action. And this Bakke, I think his first name was Alan, wanted to go to I can't remember which medical school. I know it's University of California, if it was Santa Barbara, or it was one of the UCs. And he didn't get in, and he was able to show that his MCAT scores were substantially higher than some other candidates that they did accept. And they did use race as a major percentage of admission, which was why his higher score didn't help, and he was definitely a white guy. But this ends up making quota systems unconstitutional, which is the end of direct affirmative action quota-based programs. And they still can consider race as a part of a diversity factor for college admission, but it has to be a minor part, and courts are still arguing about what minor means. So, all right. We also had a nuclear core reactor meltdown in the 70s because the 70s weren't bad enough, and that scared the crap out of us. So we don't do as much nuclear power as we used to. That kind of looked like the way we were headed. And there are certain countries, I think France is probably the most notable one, where most of their power comes from nuclear sources. However, after this, there's a core reactor meltdown in 3 Mile Island. Why can't I remember? I want to say it's Pennsylvania, but it's northeast. And after this happens, and it doesn't crack, nothing gets released into the environment. It's a near miss. I mean, but it did scare the crap out of us, and we really move away from nuclear power after that. All right, so, goodness, we still have time. Reagan. Okay. So things are rough in the 70s. Even though Carter's a good guy, when he runs for re-election, he's just kept us from going to the Olympics, blamed us for being lazy, and we can't afford bread and gas. Carter's not getting re-elected. He's just not. So you just have to be not Carter, and Reagan is not Carter, but he's also a lot more than not Carter. So just as a gentle reminder, let me see if I can find the question. Okay, let me share the weekly question. All right, and I haven't even checked the chat, but you guys aren't chatting, so which is fine. All right, analyze the success of Reagan's administration in both domestic and foreign policy. Now, in your textbook, there's a very distinct section on Reagan, so it'd be really easy to find. And I'm going to suggest that you use your textbook, please, 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 okay? Because it's outlined in a way that will help you answer this question. It's way better than looking it up on Schmoop or whatever you guys use. I don't know what you use. Albert.io, or what are those little Quizlets? Don't look up a Reagan Quizlet. Okay. I explained why he left office popular with the public despite leaving behind an enormous national debt. Okay, so you're supposed to write about what is successful in the Reagan administration as far as domestic policy, stuff at home, and foreign policy, stuff away. And I think you'll find more foreign policy stuff, but there's domestic policy stuff too. People, you know, Reagan's personality, speech making, you know, he's good at those things. All right. The first thing that Reagan asks, not the first thing, but the big thing that Reagan asks in his campaign is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? That's a good question if you're running for president in 1980, because most people are not. There's hardly anyone who is. So now Reagan's just got to convince you he can make things better. And he gets elected pretty easily. And he also says the best years of America are in the future, not the past. And we really kind of come to a point where we thought our country was near collapse. You know, the government had been dishonest with us. The economy is crap. We don't even get to go to the Olympics where we can beat the evil godless communists. I think we were misinterpreting the state of the Cold War at this point. So we're just, yeah. And Reagan also said, let's see, he said really clever stuff. If you have free time, which I know you probably do, you can always go on YouTube and just look for like Reagan jokes or Reagan videos or something. Reagan was pretty funny, and I think that's one of the things we liked about him, is that he made jokes about himself and didn't take himself too seriously. Now, people who really disliked Reagan, they really disliked Reagan, and I've got friends who disliked him so much that, you know, if I were to say Reagan around them, they might punch me. I mean, he did inspire some vitriol from people who were much more liberal than conservative, but most of the people in the middle were, you know, like most of the people in the middle typically are. You find some stuff that's good about somebody and you find stuff that you disagree with. But Reagan is, there are legitimate reasons he was controversial. So let me get back to this. So he said some of the scariest words ever said in the in the English language are, or maybe said human history, I think he said English language, are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And he said, "We have grown up in a system that believes government is the solution, but I think government is the problem." So this is that push away from federal government intervention, away from progressive policies that may have started in the progressive era, were enhanced in the New Deal, and then changed again in the Great Society. So this is a big push to get government out of as many things as you can get government out of, which is also why the South, which typically is that way, and I know 100 years ago for more nefarious reasons, and so you could argue that in the modern era, there's still nefarious reasons that you want the government out of your stuff, but I am not suggesting, you know, that Reagan was trying to bring back the worst things of our past. He said, but you may think that. I mean, of course, you can think whatever you like. His push was that what made America great were its people, not its government, so we need to give more control back to the hands of the people. And you still see that movement fairly strong, especially in the South and the Midwest. So it's really kind of a movement away from government assistance, for better or worse. And you could probably find some better and you could probably find some worse. Okay. Oddly enough, people who are traditionally Democrats, like, you know, people trace who votes for whom pretty regularly. He's going to get more female votes. Females typically are more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans. He's going to get more urban votes than Republicans typically get, although not even close to a majority. He will get lots of votes from Jewish voters who typically would vote in this era for Democrats rather than Republicans, and working class, like union members, which is definitely a Democratic constituency. So they call those folks the Reagan Coalition, and what you'll notice if you follow the vote patterns from those groupings, those folks are more likely to vote for Obama. They're also more likely to vote for Trump in the first election. I don't know that we've had a chance. It's too early to analyze votes from, we're still counting votes from this last one, so too early. That gets certified, if you're wondering, like mid-December, most likely. So maybe the controversies will be over by then. Or lawsuits, or I don't know, whatever you want to call them. All right, let's talk about what Reagan does. Here we go. One of I do remember this. This is the craziest thing to me. There was a group of people, professional air traffic controllers, and I think the O stood for organization. So this PATCO union decided that their job was crappy, which I'm sure it is, and too stressful, which I'm sure it is. These are the guys who tell they don't tell planes, they tell pilots that they can land or take off, and you know when and who's in what order, and their jobs are fairly important. And if they make a mistake, it's a huge problem. So it's a very stressful job. I'm certain of it. Is one of you going to tell me you do this for a living? Yeah. Oh my gosh. No, there's no way. I wouldn't have a stressful job like that, but I did teach high school for about 30 years, which is also stressful, but not in the same way. No, air traffic control, probably right up there with heart surgery. You just can't make a mistake. Although, I shouldn't, either of those. No, it's a terrible job. So they decide that they need better hours, working conditions. Yeah, no, it's just, yeah, it just seems terrible to me. It's got to be stressful. So they decided that they were going to go on strike unless they got, better working conditions, shorter shifts, that kind of stuff, because it really is legitimately a tough job. And Ronald Reagan said, look, we'll negotiate with you, but here's the deal. You are public safety employees. And if you go on strike, I will fire every last one of you, because airports are federally controlled and air traffic controllers are federal employees, unless it's a private airport, but even the towers, I think, are federally controlled. So the air traffic controllers say, you know what, there's no way this crazy old man, he wasn't as old as either the current fellows, current president-elect, but we hadn't had a president this old before. I think he was late 60s. But we thought, that's crazy. There's no way he'll ever do that. So the guys went on strike, and guess what he did? He fired every last one of them, and said that they could not be, that anyone who went on strike could never be rehired by the federal government. And they never were. The guy who rescinds that is Clinton, but that's like 15, 20 years later. So goodness. And if you're wondering who did the air traffic control, that would be our friends in the military. So they put a bunch of guys in the National Guard and the reserves and the active military into air traffic or air towers and said, okay, guys, you're in charge now. And they trained people on the job, which that's got to be a terrible job to learn that way. There really was not an increase in air traffic incidents where planes crashed into each other, but there were lots and lots of near misses, and they were on the news all the time. This was not a good time to fly. Even though things kind of turned out okay, they were very exciting. But it really showed people that Reagan was mostly a man of his word, even when his word was a little unusual. He did decrease defense spending in a very large way, developed something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was not lovingly called Star Wars by opponents. And it was supposed to be a missile defense initiative where we could intercept the missiles from the evil, godless communists. And he really did refer to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, which is also why people didn't feel so bad about calling his defense program Star Wars. And if you're wondering, did we ever develop this system? We did spend quite a bit of money on it. Yes and no. And goodness knows I'm not an expert on military technology. That would be the understatement of the day. However, we do develop systems where we can shoot down satellites and things in orbit when we need to. And we occasionally do this just to make sure that other folks know we can still do it. By other folks, I mean China in the modern era. Like, there were a couple of years ago where we had a communication satellite of some sort that was about to come out of orbit. And they typically like to destroy these before they get back into the atmosphere, so that way you get hit by a small chunk of stuff instead of a larger chunk of stuff if it doesn't all break up on re-entry. So NASA had an open channel where they televised this, clearly not on TV, but where other countries could watch it. And from however many tens of thousands of miles away, with the push of a button, they hit the battery pack or something on the first try. And it was just a reminder. I think it was with a particle beam, but it was just a reminder to our friends in other countries that we still have better military stuff than they do. We may not have more of it, we may not have more money, but our technology is better, and that technology started back then. But, as far as the shield, and like in movies where you just press a button and a shield comes down, of course. But, people mocked that, and there are reasons that they mocked it, and there are reasons in part that what happened was legitimate. But Reagan will increase defense spending to historic levels, will increase the size of the military. He's also going to both simultaneously negotiate with and threaten the Soviet Union, calling them the evil empire, joking on his mic checks that we are going to press the nuclear button and destroy the Soviet Union in 3, 2, 1. And people did not think that was funny for some reason. So, and it wasn't supposed to be televised, but somebody recorded it, but at any rate, goodness. But probably the most important thing that Reagan does with defense is the negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev in Iceland at Reykjavik. And there's a good section in your book about how Gorbachev is going to usher change into the Soviet Union, more openness, more Westernness, and in part because the Soviet Union is starting to fall apart because of economic reasons and political reasons. And Gorbachev wants that to be as soft a fall as possible. So, and I think the Reagan administration had a better understanding of what a bad situation the Soviet Union was in, so they knew this was the time to talk about this. But Reagan and Gorbachev pretty famously send most of their negotiators out of the room because they were arguing, and the long-term deal that they end up with really disarms almost every type of nuclear weapon that we have and would lead to complete disarmament. So it's really historic. It's really quite a serious agreement, but it's at a time where the Soviet Union is in a bad way, and then when it breaks up, a lot of those weapons go who knows where. But the deal is still fairly historic. It's clearly historic, and the state of our relationship with the Soviet Union is much different at this point. We're offering some economic aid, food, that sort of stuff. So it really is a very different sort of thing. In '89, which is the first year of older Bush's presidency, the Berlin Wall falls. By '91. No, I'm wrong. 89 is the first year of Bush's presidency, I'm sorry. And by '91, the Soviet Union is officially gone. Other Reagan stuff, and I know I got to wrap it up here in the next couple minutes. In '84, Reagan runs against Walter Mondale. '84 was really good year, as I recall. I graduated from high school that year. And also the first time we had a female vice presidential candidate. And she'll end up being Hillary Clinton's campaign manager for a while as well. She's clearly older by that point because she's running in '84 and she wasn't a kid back then, but she becomes ill. So and there's a little controversy as well, but anyway. But she's fine back then. Walter Mondale is from, I don't know. I want to say Minnesota. I think it's Minnesota. And Ferraro's from New York. Always a good choice to pick someone from New York. However, typically New York votes for Democrats, so I don't know. It's probably better to pick a swing state. But anyway, these guys run. Walter Mondale had been Jimmy Carter's vice president. Reagan wins by quite a bit. There are some scandals, always some scandals. The Boland Amendment had made it illegal for the United States to spend money, to allocate money to overthrow other people's governments. And you're thinking, did we really need to make a law about this? Yes, we did, because we spent a lot of money and used the CIA in the 60s and 70s to do things like that, which is why we made a law in the 80s to stop doing things like that. Well, this was irritating to us because we still wanted to overthrow people's governments and help friendly regimes. So the big thing that happens is the Iran-Contra affair. The Reagan administration will sell arms to Iran. And I know you're going like, didn't they just have a revolution and take a bunch of hostages? And yeah, they did. And that hostage crisis, I didn't tell you this. Why did I not tell you this? That hostage crisis ended the day that Reagan took office because Carter was trying to negotiate a peaceful end to it. It wasn't terribly successful. They wanted to weaken the Carter administration, and they did. And the final insult to Carter was that the day the hostages were released was the day that Reagan became president. So, wow. And that could have also been a sign that they were more intimidated by Reagan's potential foreign policy than Carter. And I think either of those things are legitimate, perhaps both. But the Reagan administration wants to sell arms to Iran because now we're mad at Iraq. So we want to arm Iran so they can fight against Iraq. That'll not backfire at all, I'm sure. And we armed Iraq when we were mad at Iran. So whatever. And we armed Afghanistan when we were mad at the Soviet Union. By armed, I mean sold stuff to them. Now, I also recognize, again, not an expert in military stuff. Do I need to keep saying that? That once you give people or sell people weapons, they also need parts to keep those weapons up, so we can always stop selling them parts. I know that doesn't stop everything, and those weapons will become obsolete at some point, so I recognize that sold to folks in Afghanistan probably aren't that useful now. Just saying, yeah, because that would have been the 1980s. All right, back to this. So Iran-Contra scandal. We sell weapons to Iran. We use that money to give to Nicaragua anti-communist forces that we want to overthrow the communist government in Nicaragua. So the Contras is who we're funding. This runs through possibly Colonel Oliver North in the military, I think Marine Colonel, and his trusty assistant Fawn Hall, and they get caught shredding all the evidence of the conspiracy, and they get discharged. I don't recall that it was even dishonorably discharged, but he gets discharged. There's a lot of suggestion that he probably wasn't quite at the right level to organize the entire operation, but maybe somebody who had been perhaps the head of the CIA before could have done that, and that might have been, say, the vice president, who was George Bush. Maybe, I don't know, he might have the contacts. But there's no reason to, we don't have proof of any of that stuff because, you know, shredding. So there you go. So Oliver North gets discharged, and then I remember this quite distinctly. He gets a television show on Fox News. War Stories with Oliver North, because my dad used to watch that. All right, does every person's parents watch Fox News? Because I think that's a rule. Oh, and I do need to wrap this up, don't I? General Reagan conclusions, and we can go over this a little bit more the Tuesday we come back, but I promise you there's a lot of really good information about this in your textbook. People felt like the United States was kind of back on top. The economy improves even though we have this massive national debt that we don't pay off. And a lot of it is from military spending, but also, interestingly enough, the size of the government does get a little bit bigger. Now, what the government does changes. So the economy improves, we feel better about ourselves, the military gains funding, and, you know, we were feeling a little low about the military after the hostage situation in Iran, but, you know, we're going to send troops to a few places during this era, and places where they're successful. So Republicans, Falkland Islands, I remember that from my teen years. Republicans win the South. So this is when the South starts becoming reliably Republican. I know Georgia, but reliably Republican. The Reagan coalition is more diverse, includes blue-collar workers, Southerners, more people of color, Jews, and women. And you see the Republicans briefly have control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate. So lots of things get changed, but also this is an era where the Republicans and Democrats really meet in the middle more and work together on stuff. And you'll see that in the Reagan era. You'll see that in George Bush, older Bush, and you'll see that in the Clinton era. So the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton presidencies, maybe in some ways people meet a little more in the middle. I know that we would consider Reagan a little more right of center, although in the modern era, who knows where that fits. But for that time, he's definitely more conservative. But the legislation that's passed in that era is usually collaborative. One of the big things that happens too is that tax rates are lowered substantially. The top tax rates are. And the book will talk about this in more detail than I did, about something called Reaganomics or trickle-down economics, where you give more money to the top earners in society who are typically business owners, and they'll expand their businesses, they'll hire more people, and that money will trickle down to the bottom. And trickle is probably the right word for that. However, I know that there are some business owners and corporations that are really good about sharing their profits with their employees, but those are few and far between. Maybe H-E-B, Home Depot, maybe. I don't know. Maybe Starbucks, probably not. I don't know. All right. I think it's probably time to stop because it's almost time to go, but I do need to take roll. And if you guys have any questions, are you guys still there? You still there? You're still there. All right.
Yep, still here. All good.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thanks for being there. Yeah, and that air traffic control, that's a tough job. Okay, so I'll try to check you guys off really quick. Let me stop recording so we don't have evidence of this.